I have sent to the Congress today a series of proposals to help fight mental illness and mental retardation. These two afflictions have been long neglected. They occur more frequently, affect more people, require more prolonged treatment, cause more individual and family suffering than any other condition in American life.
Prior to the 1960s, the standard in mental health care was to institutionalize patients. However, as a result of the deinstitutionalization movements of the 50s and 60s, the Community Mental Health Centers Act of 1963 was passed in order to promote community-centered mental health care and the dismantling of dysfunctional mental hospitals. This created a new frontier in how mental health would be treated. Focus shifted from intensive inpatient care to community-centered outpatient care. Prior to the 18th century, mental illness was thought to be a spiritual problem. These people were often incarcerated where they suffered abuse. However, due to the Enlightenment movement, a greater emphasis was placed on physical causes. Moral treatment became popular. This centered on the idea that the mentally ill may be cared for if they were treated with kindness and learned to think rationally. However, at the same time, hospitals such as the Pennsylvania Hospital still existed, where patients would be kept in chains and basement cells. Hospitals based on moral treatment were significantly better. However, only the upper class could afford them. Hospitals lower class patients were sent to were often overcrowded and understaffed. During the progressive movement in the 1850s, activists such as Dorothea Dix started lobbying for change. By the 1870s, the construction of 32 state hospitals were being funded by the U.S. government. Asylum spread across America. However, only a portion of patients were kept there. The rest stayed in jails, where they were neglected and abused. This continued into the 40s and 50s. However, during the 30s, new and harmful treatments such as electroshock therapy and lobotomies were being used. These treatments were often seen as miracle cures and ways to deal with unruly patients. World War II was a major catalyst in the development of the deinstitutionalization movement of the 50s and 60s. It had forced people to confront the reality of mental health care during the time. One of the ways it did this was through enlistment. According to General Lewis B. Hershey, director of the Selective Service System, mental illness was the greatest cause of non-effectiveness or loss of manpower. Soldiers on alternative duty also contributed to the condemnation of mental hospitals. During the war, 1/3 of which were assigned to mental hospitals. The reports described the horrifying conditions of them. This opened the nation's eyes to how widespread the problem of mental illness was and the poor conditions of mental hospitals. It paved the way for advocates such as Robert Felix to create a significant change. Robert Felix was a major advocate for community-centered treatment and was against state hospitals. He contributed to the creation of the National Institute of Mental Health, or the NIMH, and was the chief of the Mental Health Hygiene Division of the Public Health Service. Most notably, though, he created the plan that would allocate government funds in fighting mental illness. With the work of mental health care advocates, laws appointing the mentally ill would be put into place. However, the one that would transform healthcare wouldn't come until the election of President John F. Kennedy. His family has had a long and complicated history with mental illness. His sister, Rosemary Kennedy, showed signs that she was on the spectrum of schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, and bipolar disorder with psychotic features. The cause of this is linked to her birth. Because the main doctor wasn't available, the nurse who was in charge of delivering Rosemary attempted to keep her from being delivered, ordering her mother to keep her legs closed and eventually pushing the baby's head back into the birth canal. Attitudes towards the disabled led to her father, Joseph Kennedy, attempting to hide her. A major reason for this was the eugenics movement. This was the idea that certain groups of people had a bad gene and should not be allowed to reproduce. The Kennedys were afraid that society and their religion would think they had a bad gene if they knew about Rosemary. This led her to be kept under a watchful eye. She was sent to live in a convent in London where her father was an ambassador and was assigned people to look after her. Joseph Kennedy eventually resorted to have Dr. Walter Freeman and Dr. James Wasp perform a lobotomy on her. This was an invasive procedure which aimed to sever the nerve pathways of the frontal lobes and separate them from the rest of the brain. The lobotomy made her condition much worse, leaving her to lose her ability to speak and perform basic everyday tasks. This forced her to spend the rest of her days in St. Coletta's School for Exceptional Children, a convent in Jefferson, Wisconsin, where she could remain hidden from the public. While Rosemary Kennedy's father intended to hide her, other Kennedys did not feel the same way. What happened to his sister greatly affected John F. Kennedy and gave him the push needed to reform the mental health care system. With the help of his sister, Eunice Kennedy Shriver, he set into action plans to help the mentally ill. This was very encouraging to mental health care advocates. Kennedy used public outrage to gain support for his reforms. He even compared the Cold War to the mental health care system crisis. By 1961, President Kennedy announced the President's Panel on Intellectual Disability. This was formed to make recommendations on issues regarding mental illness. The Interagency Committee on Mental Health was also formed. They eventually adopted Robert Felix's plan to make community mental health care a reality. By this time, major developments in mental health care were also being made. A new drug discovered in 1952 called Thorazine greatly reduced delusions, hallucinations, and manic symptoms. The development of new drugs made community mental health care seem more realistic. With all these factors, the deinstitutionalization movement of the 50s and 60s were well on its way to produce the Community Mental Health Care Act of 1963. On October 31st, 1963, President John F. Kennedy signed the Community Mental Health Centers Act. This was a revolutionary act meant to start the creation of community-centered mental health care. It is a 17-page document outlining the details of combating mental illness through grants. These grants would support the construction of research centers, facilities, and community centers dedicated to fighting mental illness. Anyone from non-profit institutions to universities could apply for the grants. It also involved money for training teachers of mentally ill children. There was much support for the act, as it was seen as the necessary step to end the now villainized institutionalization. However, critics pointed out that the act lacked funds to properly deinstitutionalize and would shift the burden onto families. In 1966, the first federally funded community mental health center opened. By 1967, 53 other centers opened. In the following 13 years, a total of 789 centers would open. Even though the act did not directly mention hospitals, they would still be impacted by it. The number of patients decreased by 165,571 people between 1960 and 1969. This was because court cases about whether to send or keep people in hospitals were beginning to rule they wouldn't have to go if a less restrictive alternative was found, such as community mental health centers. Also, with the creation of Medicare and Medicaid, hospitals were less incentivized to keep patients because these programs would not cover mental illness. As less and less people were admitted to mental hospitals, the more they started to close. Soon, community mental health care centers became the predominant form of mental health care. This greatly reduced the mentally ill's exposure to abuse in mental hospitals. However, access to care provided by community mental health centers became very difficult to find. There was a lack of funding needed to properly deinstitutionalize, and therefore a lack of resources needed to care for those with mental illness. This resulted in trans-institutionalization, which is the institutionalization of people with mental illness in nursing homes, hospitals, and jails. There was also an increase of homelessness due to deinstitutionalization, because with the closing of mental hospitals, the mentally ill often had nowhere to go. Those with severe mental illness were also less likely to have family support. Those with family support put a greater stress on their family members. The Community Mental Health Centers Act of 1963 was an act that revolutionized how mental health would be treated in America. Before the act, people who suffered from mental illness would be institutionalized in hospitals where they suffered abuse. However, the Community Mental Health Centers Act allowed for the creation of community mental health centers. The creation of these centers phased out the use of hospitals by decreasing the number of patients in them. This led community-centered mental health care to be the primary type of mental health care. It is also important to note that the Act was supposed to improve the conditions of mental health care pre-1960s. The Act did significantly change the care offered, but didn't necessarily better the situation for sufferers of mental illness. They are no longer exposed to the abuse that occurred in these hospitals, but the likelihood of homelessness and incarceration increased for them. The historical significance of the Community Mental Health Centers Act is that it shaped the way how modern mental illness would be treated. By studying the Act and identifying its problems, hopefully we can solve them and find a better future.